Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. To embark upon a discussion of matters so divergent as faith and economics is perhaps to court derision. For, while faith, as everyone knows, is fundamentally irrational, and conjures up images of the simple-minded reverencing a hypothetical deity, economics brings to mind visions of cold, hard figures, and equally cold, cerebral men in steel-gray business suits, regarding each other with cold eyes. Faith connotes the fanciful, economics the resistlessly real. Nevertheless, there is a point at which faith, insofar as it is evidence, does suggest to us something that, though real, is not quite wholly realized. And there is a point at which mere economics is transmuted, when simple household management becomes a mystery, and the men in steel-gray suits are transfigured into votaries of a religion that may have no relation at all to the facts of supply and demand. At this point, the normal connotations of faith and economics become an inversion of reality, and when economics becomes a system of belief, we are perhaps justified in resorting to a humbler faith. Hugh Gaitskell, in criticizing C.H. Douglas as a monetary reformer, evinces just this confusion between religious faith and what he is pleased to estimate as economic science. Having stated a dogmatic position in which religion is characterized by dogma and obscurity, Gaitskell declares, "It is not only for his conviction, but also for his methods that Major Douglas must be regarded as a religious rather than a scientific reformer." What is implied, of course, is that science has a valid relation to reality. Religion does not, but is more akin to black magic or superstition. Gaitskell has a right to define his terms. However, his use of the words scientific and religious as antithetical, particularly with reference to Douglas, betrays a sorry understanding of either. Moreover, it betrays the limitations of his own system of belief. It is arguable that scientific dogmatism, especially in an age that is challenging facile empiricism, is no more valid than religious dogmatism, if by dogmatism is meant the assertion of principles without evidence. Douglas would certainly have described his own approach as religious, but he was scrupulous to define what he meant by the term. Gaitskell, in perverting the meaning of religious, displays not only intellectual dishonesty, but also those characteristics of superstition, dogmatism, and obscurity, which he attributes to Douglas. Unlike Gaitskell, who implies the unreality of religion, Douglas insists upon the relationship of religion to reality. I quote, "In the sense that I am going to use it, and I think I will be using it correctly, the word religion has to do with a conception of reality. It is the binding back either of action or of policy to reality. Insofar as it means to bind back, to bring into close relation again, and in that sense I am going to use it, religion is any sort of doctrine which is based upon an attempt to relate action to some conception of reality." End of quote. What we believe about reality will determine our approach to that reality. If the conception of reality to which policy or action is related is incorrect, then, of course, religion will be false or heretical. Again, unlike Gaitskell, who implies the absolute truth of his religion by calling it science, Douglas admits the possibility of erroneous belief. I quote, "It does not necessarily mean that your conception of reality is a correct one, but it does mean that you are postulating that there is something to which you refer as real, and that you are basing your policy upon that reality." End of quote. In other words, every policy is based upon a philosophy or conception of reality. Belief or faith is realized in policy, and the results of this policy are the fruits by which we can estimate the validity of the underlying religion. Since the policy of Douglas's philosophy has never been completely realized, we do not know that it is wrong. Rather, there is reason for us to credit it, for it is by definition limited by reality. The economic science of Gaitskell is, on the other hand, a palpable denial of reality, the consequences of which we feel daily. Before proceeding to a consideration of the violation of truth by inexorable economic law, we ought perhaps to look at Douglas's religion more particularly, in order to answer Gaitskell's allegations. Douglas makes the following explicit confession of faith. Again, I quote, "Now it is my belief that there is running through the nature of the universe something that we call a canon. It is the thing which is referred to in the Gospel of St. John as the Logos, the Word. The engineer and the artist refer to it when they say they have got something right. Other people mean the same thing when they talk about absolute truth or reality." End of quote. He asserts his conviction that there is something real. He does not go on to prescribe what reality is, but suggests that it is recognizable when it is realized. His faith is in an underlying reality that interfuses the very nature of things. From this, we may conclude of Douglas that he is an absolutist in religion. Truth is not, for him, a matter of subjective relativism. At the same time, however, he makes no dogmatic assertions about the nature of reality, except that it is real, and he implies what is real is right, but he eschews any attempt to make reality into a system. Rather, it is something that unfolds itself to the careful searcher. This is the extent of Douglas's dogmatism. At this fundamental level, the issue of faith resolves itself into the question, is anything real? Douglas is convinced that there is a reality. Gaitskell, to judge from his own conviction, appears to be similarly convinced that something is real, although he seems to have somewhat different beliefs about reality. Examination suggests that Douglas's is the humbler faith, attending as it does upon discovery, while Gaitskell's implies not only that there is an absolute truth, but that this truth is manifest in the economic system. This brings us to a consideration of religious methods, for which Douglas has also been criticized. Significantly, Douglas suggests in his examples of the engineer and the artist that this canon of which he speaks, this underlying principle of reality, is recognizable most readily in its incarnations. The Word, it will be recalled, became flesh. In this he is adopting a religious position that may be described as Christian. The central fact of Christian faith is the incarnation of the Word. This principle of incarnation is universal, comprehending both natural and moral relationships. Richard Hooker, for example, declares the similarity of natural and moral rectitude when he says, "Goodness in actions is like unto straightness, wherefore that which is done well we term right." Righteousness and rightness are one, and they are recognizable similarly in their results, in their realizations. The consequences of this observation for a religious method are crucial. Religious assertions are not prescriptive, but descriptive. Moreover, not only does incarnation reveal truth, it also is the method of realizing faith, of manifesting the evidence of things unseen. As a method, as an approach to reality, incarnation is the antithesis of what Gaitskell implies in his references to dogmatism and obscurity. Of his own method, Douglas says, and I quote, "Genuine success only accompanies a consistent attempt to discover and conform to this canon in no matter what sphere our activities may lie." Unquote. Discovery, it will be remarked, precedes conformity. That is to say, ironically, that Douglas's method is not only religious, but it is also scientific. It is the inductive method of science adumbrated by Sir Francis Bacon. Douglas was himself an engineer. When he first glimpsed in the field of industrial cost accounting what he refers to as a portion of reality, he was not looking for facts to demonstrate a proposition. Rather, certain facts came to his attention, and he attempted to describe the situation which they indicated. In a sense, therefore, Douglas's assertions about the nature of things cannot be merely unrealistic dogma. His own religious methods require that they proceed from reality. His facts may be incorrect, or his interpretation of them may be inaccurate, but his method cannot be dogmatic because it insists upon making observations before drawing conclusions. He has no pre-formulated conception of the way things ought to be. It is clear, therefore, that both Douglas's conviction and his methods are bound back to reality. Thus, contrary to his critical intention, Gaitskell has paid Douglas the compliment of accuracy in labeling him a religious reformer. Ironically, it is in terms of Douglas's definition of religion, and not Gaitskell's, that the latter's accuracy rests. Faith for Douglas is initially the conviction that there is a reality, and that there is a method whereby this reality may be approached. This paper is concerned with the breakdown of such faith in the crucial field of economics. Douglas, as we have seen, places his faith in what he calls a canon, or in an objective, discoverable, and incarnate reality. The correctness of things he takes as evidence for the reality that underlies these things. This, as has been remarked, provides a criterion by which to evaluate our concept of reality. Does it work out in its incarnations? By their fruits, we have been cautioned, ye shall know them. If the correctness of things appears to contradict our conception of reality, then, perhaps, we should reconsider our religion. In purely religious terms, if we pervert the right ways of the Lord, our faith must suffer. If faith contradicts the canon, then it is logical to expect that we shall lose our faith, or, as has happened in Christianity, we shall have to transcendentalize our faith, dissociate it from reality. In either case, our approach to reality is likely to suffer. Faith will degenerate either to despair or to the dogma and obscurity that haunt Gaitskell. Writing in Realistic Constitutionalism, Douglas observes that something like this dissociation of faith from reality occurred at the fork in the road somewhere about the time of the so-called Reformation. It is not my intention to become involved in the controversy over the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism with Weber, Troeltsch, Tawney, and their multifarious critics, except to observe that, as in most speculations of this type, there is some truth, but that they tend to attribute too much to accident and too little to design. My interest in the immediate post-Reformation period, for the purposes of this study, is simply that people at that time spoke more unabashedly of religion than they do now. Since phenomena that remain with us today were then verbalized in specifically religious language, their earlier manifestations offer significant parallels with current syndromes in the realm of faith and economics. Even if the present is not contingent upon the past, we may at least look to history for analogies. In 1616, Godfrey Goodman, chaplain to Queen Anne, wrote a lengthy treatise entitled The Fall of Man, or the Corruption of Nature. His thesis is straightforward enough. He argued that nature, both human and external, was in a state of decay, and that the dissolution of the world was imminent. That he was wrong is now obvious. What is important are his beliefs and how he arrived at them. Significantly, as Victor Harris remarks in All Coherence Gone, many of the disturbances which Goodman records are reflections of an unsettled economy. To take one example, Goodman notices the enormous, almost modern, inflation that occurred in England during the century after 1530. R.B. Outhwaite records it at about 700%. What is interesting to note is Goodman's inference from this observation. Quote, "To conclude, these excessive prices of things do well argue a great scarcity, that the whole world is turned bankrupt." Unquote. From this he further concludes that the whole situation was evidence of the heavy judgments of God. Goodman's logic is significant for its revelation of the complex psychology involved in the relationship between one's perception of reality and his faith. The first thing to note is that Goodman's perception of reality is mediated. He draws an inference about economic reality, scarcity of goods, from the financial indicator, high prices. We are reminded of L.C. Knight's observation, quote, "The force of money in determining the course of the world's history meets us at every turn at this period." Unquote. What is not mentioned is that money, because of its identification with commodities, silver and gold, was a highly misunderstood phenomenon. The idea of the intrinsic value of money interfered with its function as a facility for the distribution of real wealth. The problem, of course, was one of how correctly to incarnate value. Price, which in fact is no more than a ratio, the ratio between consumption and production in a given period, had assumed a mystical significance largely because of the collapse of the just relationship between the mind, ideas, and things. For Goodman's conclusion to be sound, his premise, that the price was in fact an accurate indication of the condition of the economy, would have had to be correct. If high prices do not indeed argue a great scarcity, then his conception of reality will be distorted to the extent that his premise is false. That it may have been false is suggested by the proliferation of other possible explanations of the inflation: the profit inflation associated with the beginnings of modern capitalism, the rise of the international money market, the discovery of American gold and silver, the vast expenditures upon wars of religion. One contemporary of Goodman, E. Misselden, argues that the cause of high prices is in fact too many goods. Quote, "The general remote cause of our want of money is the great excess of this kingdom in consuming the commodities of foreign countries, which prove to be discommodities in hindering us of so much treasure which otherwise would be brought in lieu of these toys." Unquote. There seems, indeed, to have been considerable confusion about the exact function of price, or money, as an economic indicator. The point is that Goodman is basing his faith upon what may very well have been an abstraction from reality. Although Jevons has suggested a causal relationship between sunspots and economic depressions, no modern commentator has followed Goodman in attributing the inflation in Tudor England to the wrath of God, not in so many words. That Goodman resorts to his transcendental judgment, which, ironically, is accurate, since false household management is a perversion of the right ways of the Lord, and thus entails the consequences of perversion, brings us to another aspect of faith. A faulty perception of economic reality leads Goodman to make a statement about his conception of ultimate reality, God, which tends, by means of a grandiose metaphor, to divert the mind from real and proximate causes. God becomes an excuse for the inability to approach reality. God is dissociated from reality. Goodman's faith is now in a God divorced from reality. As this type of faith denies truth, it also denies responsibility. Tudor Jones remarks upon this phenomenon of the displacement of proximate causes by uncontrollable alibis. The result, a postulation of crude determinism and the vitiation of human will and responsibility, obviates another aspect of incarnation, namely immanent sovereignty. The basis of faith, the confidence in the possibility of approaching God, is thus undermined, and Goodman's faith becomes a kind of sense of helplessness. As R. H. Tawney observes, matters of money tended to evoke the response in all plain men that there is some mystery in the matter, and that God must look after economics. Perhaps Goodman and other plain men ought to have attended more closely to the words of Sir Thomas Gresham, founder, in 1568, of the Royal Exchange. Gresham, explaining fluctuations in exchange rates, attributes them to his own art and God's providence. What is suggested here is that the proximate cause of financial phenomena lies in the wills of men. In other words, the policy of those who controlled the abstraction, in this case money, may have been the real reason for high prices. One man's art is another man's mystery, and one certain way to guarantee the success of a policy is to ensure that those who might object to it do not understand it. Presumably, as has been remarked, faith is realized in policy. The financier's conception of reality, if it is only self-aggrandizement like that of the Renaissance moneylender Jacob Fugger, whose religion was comprised in the accumulation of financial capital even when he was too old to know what to do with it, will determine his policy. And the theologian's conception of reality will determine his policy. Goodman, believing that God is laying his heavy judgments on the land, adopts the policy of writing a fairly pessimistic treatise which argues for a retreat into a kind of abstract, certainly disincarnate, theology that in fact destroys the relationship between faith and reality. The value of this foray into the mists of time is at this stage intended to be mainly analogical. It presents, in undisguised theological language, an example of the effect of economic circumstance upon faith. To those who argue a continuity between the rise of capitalism in the Reformation period and contemporary financial religion, the example will have greater significance. The process that is illustrated is crucial. The dissociation of the sign, money, from the thing signified, wealth, erodes the basis of faith, which in turn allows further disruptions of the approach to reality. Douglas argues that the fundamental falsity of the present financial system is that it distorts and perverts reality. If he is correct, the consequences for faith will be enormous. The whole mechanism of our economic relationships will have frustrated our attempts to realize our credit. It is to a consideration of Douglas's test of any financial scheme, that is, that it reflects reality, that I shall now turn, considering particularly those tenets which underline our present financial arrangements. In referring to Douglas as one of 4 monetary heretics, Gaitskell implies, and Douglas I think would hardly have disagreed, that the financial system has a religious basis. That is, if the financial system embodies a policy, that policy will be determined by the religion, conception of reality, of the manipulators of the system. In this matter, Douglas does not postulate what the end of man is, but he does insist that economic activity is merely a functional activity, and as such constitutes a restriction of the free expansion of individuality. Therefore, within the limits of economic, not monetary, reality, Douglas's objective, or policy, would be to free men and women from purely functional activity. The opposite point of view is, of course, embodied in the conception of the economic system as a means of government or constraint. To St. Paul goes the rather dubious honor of having said, "Thus we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat." 1 Timothy 3:10. One would wish that this had simply been a statement of administration determined by the exigencies of a specific situation, and not a statement of policy, work as an end in itself. In any case, in matters of Christian faith, we must defer to the higher authority of Christ himself, who admonishes, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin." The argument is that the field exists for the flower, and that, even in the matter of economics, grace, something for nothing, can be realized. This view has found expression in later spokesmen for Christian orthodoxy, notably the great Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas. I quote, "Poverty is not a good in itself. Insofar as poverty removes the good resulting from riches, it is simply an evil. Spiritual danger ensues from poverty when the latter is not voluntary, because those who are unwilling poor fall into many great sins." Similarly, the great Anglican theologian Richard Hooker has said, and I quote, "True it is that the kingdom of God must be the first thing in our purposes and desires. But inasmuch as righteous life presupposeth life, inasmuch as to live virtuously it is impossible except we live, therefore the first impediment which naturally we endeavor to remove is penury and want of those things without which we cannot live." End of quote. The emphasis is upon the desirability of economic arrangements which, as far as is consistent with reality, free the soul of man to seek the kingdom of God, whatever that may be. Christian policy, it would appear, is diametrically opposed to the idea that he who shall not work, neither shall he eat, which denies God's gift of abundance. Nevertheless, there are those whose faith reposes in the desirability of economic coercion. Various commentators, for example Charles and Catherine George and Michael Walzer, have noted the association of the work ethic with that aberration known as Puritanism. Tawney quotes the 18th century economist Arthur Young as having expressed the Puritan position when he said, and I quote, "Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor, or they will never be industrious." End of quote. As with all labels, however, Puritanism tends to conjure up different images to different people. Thus it is the policy and not the name that concerns us. The policy is the elevation of work to an end in itself and the use of economic coercion as a form of moral restraint. Thus, if Puritanism describes this policy, Karl Marx, who was concerned with individuals only insofar as they are personifications of economic categories, was an arch-Puritan. So was George Bernard Shaw, who spoke of the keystone of socialism as compulsory labor, with death as the final penalty. We see, then, that in respect of the objective of economic activity, there are two radically different faiths, issuing in two radically different policies. Unfortunately, those who control our economic lives appear dedicated to the faith in labor as the end of man. When it was suggested to Montague Norman, former governor of the Bank of England, that the policy of that institution was preventing prosperity, he is said to have replied, quote, "I don't believe that it is good for a people to be prosperous," unquote. Presumably, he used the financial monopoly at his disposal to impose the policy of his philosophy upon everyone else. Similarly, the former Canadian cabinet minister, Eric Kierans, reacted in horror to the suggestion that man seeks not work, but the results of his work. I quote, "Nothing is so humiliating has ever been proposed to a people, that the object of man's existence, the goal of society, shall be his personal consumption. Socialists and even communists are more honest than that. They know the necessity of work." End of quote. This, then, appears to be the religion of our financiers and politicians, including Hugh Gaitskell. At this point, we should perhaps query, who are the heretics? Thus, in view of the convictions of these flamens of high finance, one of the dogmas that has been foisted onto society is the myth of full employment. From the point of view of an orthodoxy that seeks to integrate means and ends, this particular heretical doctrine constitutes what St. Thomas Aquinas has called the essence of sin, the elevation of means into ends. Douglas has elaborated this estimation of full employment and suggested its ultimate consequences. I quote, "Institutions, the economic system," he means, "are a means to an end, and I do not think it is too much to say that the elevation of means into ends constitutes an unforgivable sin, in the pragmatic sense that it brings upon itself the most tremendous penalties that life contains." End of quote. The relationship of the individual soul to reality, to the kingdom of God, is prevented by a system of nearly inescapable coercion. Under the circumstances, free will, the directing of the will towards or away from truth, is scarcely more than an academic question. The locus of compulsion is intransigently external. Sin is sin because it perverts reality and thus annihilates faith. The perversion of reality entails predictable consequences. Full employment is vicious not only in that it represents a religion of coercion, but also in that it is unreal. It goes against economic facts. How unreal it is demonstrated by the perennial concern of politicians and economists that dealing with the Scylla of unemployment will cast us upon the Charybdis of inflation. Within the context of the present system, full employment and relative price stability are mutually exclusive, but the point is that neither is a legitimate economic objective in any case. C.S. Lewis has very perceptively pointed out that the devil always sends errors into the world in pairs of apparently contradictory opposites and asks, "Choose the lesser evil." No, thank you. What we really want is leisure and falling prices. The question is, can it be done, and not, does it fit in with the prescriptions of the system? Nevertheless, employment is maintained at an artificially high rate, as a result of such doctrines as superproduce and export or die. It is one of the ironies of modern economic arrangements that a country measures its economic health in terms of its ability to keep people working overtime to produce goods which will immediately be shipped off to the ends of the earth. Douglas notes that this policy derives psychological reinforcement from what he calls the doctrine of progress, the belief that it is inherently desirable to keep people employed in the overproduction of gadgets and in the export of these, quote, "in order that the blessings of a gadget civilization may be carried to the benighted heathen," unquote. Here, once more, we observe the formulation of religious dogma from the facts of a false economic indicator, with the consequent reaction upon economic objectives. This is veritable idolatry. The ability to distinguish the real is lost, and civilization reels from repletion. Conceived in perversion, the doctrines of full employment and export or die issue ultimately in death. Paul Samuelson, for example, asks how the United States, after 1940, was able to become the arsenal of democracy and enjoy higher living standards than ever before. The answer, quote, "largely by taking up the slack in unemployment." End of quote. Incomes cannot be distributed until an excuse can be found for excessive capital production. What Samuelson fails to ask is, why must our standard of living be a direct function of our ability to manufacture the means of death? It is a predictable characteristic of a heinous financial system that it thrives on murder. Presumably, the United States cannot afford to leave Vietnam until suitable trade arrangements can be made with Peking. By their fruits shall ye know them. The religion of full employment is sinful and results in the penalties of sin: coercion, alienation, pollution, and death. It attacks the very basis of real faith and sacrifices man upon the altar of functionalism. It is a sad testimony to our lack of faith that we will not accept grace in its economic incarnations. However, like Goodman unable to penetrate the mystery, modern man consoles himself with the contemporary equivalent of Goodman's alibi, the laws of economics, and desperately acquiesces in the consequences of a perversity that, in normal conditions of faith, would be neither ignored nor tolerated. Despair, the sin against the Holy Spirit, is the precise opposite of faith, and the loss of touch with reality issues in despair. Thus, Goodman's statement of faith, namely, God is doing this thing, is in fact, though Gaitskell would disagree, a statement of profound desperation. In effect, it is an abdication of personal moral responsibility for evil or error, and a foisting of that responsibility onto an uncontrollable, and in this case misunderstood, abstraction. Frustration is the logical consequence, a frustration complemented by the dubious consolation of something wholly other that can be blamed. As Tudor Jones remarks, we are realists in our pleasures, but not in our pains. Despair, in a significant sense, is the inability to accept our relationship to God. Faith, on the other hand, complements grace, which becomes real when it is realized. Faith is the human disposition which corresponds to the divine gift. Faith, in other words, is the human disposition which regards reality and which is firm in its cooperation with reality. It will accept nothing less than what is real. At the social level, we are considering household management in society, it will be recalled. At the social level, faith is the confidence of people working in association that they can get what they want. This confidence would clearly be absurd if the reality did not complement the faith. The reality is, of course, that, economically speaking, the world is originally endowed with wealth, and that the application of the correct principles of association results in fecundity. The creative principle can either be frustrated or fostered. In this set of alternatives is comprised the choice offered to men of despair or faith. Men in society may agree to frustrate productivity or to encourage it. Their decision, limited by their real capabilities to do either, will determine the extent to which faith may realize grace. In other words, social faith, or social credit, is, quote, the efficiency measured in terms of human satisfaction of human beings in association, end of quote. As we have seen, then, religion has to do with faith or credit, with reliance, confidence, trust. Credit is reinforced by results. The correctness of our religion is confirmed in the results which arise from our policy based upon that conception of reality. The antithesis of this condition of credit is doubt. In 1542, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word credit in the economic sense was used for the first time in English. It meant, quote, confidence in a buyer's ability to pay at some future time for goods, etc., entrusted to him without present payment. End of quote. This special use of the word is an exact reflection of its more comprehensive meaning. Its perversion is similarly an index of the perversion of faith in the larger sense. As Douglas pointed out, the financial system does not credit society with its social credit. It debits us instead. Since credit is not generated quickly enough by the employment system, even, it must be remarked, the full employment system, we are forced, as the public or as individuals, to borrow, hence the national debt and consumer credit. Of course, just as the national debt of, say, England has been growing since the 17th century, so there is no reason to credit the consumer's ability to pay. He never can. The financial picture is drawn awry. It does not reflect reality. It denies the social credit. From looking at the false picture, society begins to believe that it is real. At the level of faith, the social credit is discredited. Faith in the unreal is not faith at all. It is doubt, the psychological equivalent of the social debt perpetrated by faulty finance. One of the most vicious consequences of this false financial picture, which disintegrates the faith of society, is that other leviathan of the money cult, inflation. What inflation implies is that our efficiency, reflected in price, will diminish with time. If price, the financial index, indicates the state of the social credit, inflation leads to the startling conclusion that, in spite of technology and organization supposedly having increased in efficiency, it is harder for us to get what we want. The social credit is undermined by inflation. The interposition of money between economics and the human sufferer results in a disintegration of the social credit. The consequences of this disintegration, based again upon the dissociation of the abstraction, price, from the thing itself, wealth, are invariably frustrating and ultimately disastrous. Money constitutes a means of effective demand. It is an economic vote. A diminution of the power of that vote constitutes an assault on the power of choice, on personal sovereignty. Douglas has indicated the results of this kind of disenfranchisement. In the USSR, Lenin destroyed money as an effective order system by means of a policy of inflation. The credit, faithfulness to reality, of money was obliterated. The results are indicated in Douglas's observation, and I quote, "A new basis of credit was required, and Mr. Trotsky obligingly stepped in with an excellent machine-gun corps." End of quote. The policy, like that of full employment, is the imposition of external sovereignty, the antithesis of the free expansion of personality advocated by Christ, Aquinas, and Hooker. Finance is used to destroy faith. Then another kind of faith is imposed from without. The Incarnation is the Christian answer to this process. It opposes reality to abstractionism and immanent to non-immanent sovereignty. The problem, ultimately, with idolatry, taking the sign for the thing itself and worshipping it, is that it involves the attribution of the qualities of reality to an abstraction. If the abstraction is not bound back to reality, it will of course exhibit not the characteristics of reality, but of falsehood, which is of Satan, the father of lies. Thus we come to the opinion of John Selden. I quote, "'Tis a vain thing to say money begets not money, for that no doubt it does." Or of the eminent American divine, Orville Dewey, who says, quote, "The same principle which applies to every other commodity applies to that commodity called money." Unquote. At the risk of appearing old-fashioned, I must oppose to these views the observation of Thomas Adams, quote, "Money is a non-fruitful thing by nature, made only for commutation. It is a preternatural thing that it should engender money. This is monstrosus partus, a prodigious birth." End of quote. The adulation of money has begotten a perversion of the creative principle. Money as a counting system is relevant, meaningful, only insofar as there is something to be counted. How much means nothing until it becomes how much calico, permanganate, or asparagus. The quantitative abstraction has reality only when it is incarnated. Money cannot beget money. To accept that it does denies the interposition of reality between two quantities of money. Men can make money, as much or as little as they like. Money can be transferred in order to facilitate the reassociation of wealth in the creation of new wealth, for which a money equivalent may or may not be created. If more money is made with no corresponding increase in real wealth, then all you have is more pieces of paper with numbers on them relative to real wealth. Money is not begotten, it is created. How much money there is determined not by nature, but by human convention or human policy. If that policy is to pervert reality, then we are confronted with idolatry and will be asked to credit absurd propositions such as money begets money, which is tantamount to saying 7 begets 11, and just as comprehensible. If our abstractions are busy engendering, it is small wonder that our religious confusion will result in the frustration of the real creativity inherent in nature. John Ruskin divides labor into positive and negative. Quote, "Positive, that which produces life; negative, that which produces death. The most directly negative labor being murder, the most directly positive the bearing and rearing of children." Unquote. This is a useful distinction, for it epitomizes the choice before us, life versus death. It is also a telling comment upon an article of faith imposed by the financial system, such as the belief that, because it is economically, read financially, inconvenient to have children, abortion is a wholesome, even a prestigious practice. The inability to distinguish reality from illusion leads to conclusions like that of the Toronto Globe and Mail, commenting on the decision of the Canadian government to pay farmers not to grow wheat. Quote, "There is an inescapable immorality in paying farmers not to grow food when half the world is hungry and some of it is starving. But it's a crazy world." End of quote. Here we have again the reaction of Godfrey Goodman, except in this case the newspaper's hypothetical deity is the irrationality of the world. The expression of despair is profound. There is religion and there is religion. The religion of economics, referred to earlier and also known by the name finance, is one sort of religion. The object of its worship is money, which, as we have seen, is merely quantitative, merely an abstraction. The abstraction determines the premises of this religion. The premises, because they are idolatrous, not bound back to economic reality, are vicious. This religion, in fact a kind of black magic or superstition, is what we are asked to place our faith in. We are asked to credit a palpable falsehood, which is neither scientific nor genuinely religious. No wonder our faith is imperiled. The superstition of scarcity, engendered in a false relationship between ideas and things and fostered by a continuing assault on credit, eventuates in a sense of hopelessness, of spiritual despair, of anti-life. In denying natural fecundity, it denies grace, the something for nothing without which the dynamics of creation and salvation, not to mention economics, cannot proceed. Our religion of scarcity, manifested in the financial system, can be accurately described as anti-sacramental. If a sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward, invisible grace, then the financial system, as a false sign or abstraction from reality, is a denial of the grace in which our faith must rest. At the same time, it vitiates our potential to become conscious and self-creative, to participate in our own salvation. This false religion issues in coercion, denying faith, and obviating responsibility. Morality, founded upon choice, is forced out of the question. Without morality, there is no personality. We are not allowed to do good because it is good. But Richard Hooker suggests that precisely this is the problem before us spiritually. I quote, "Behold, saith Moses, I have set before you this day good and evil, life and death. Concerning will, he addeth immediately, choose life, that is to say, the things that tend unto life, them choose." End of quote. Good is equated with life, evil is equated with death, and the essence of the opposition of the two religions is epitomized in the perversion of the word election from its meaning of choosing to being chosen. When choice is gone, life is gone. Douglas claims to have glimpsed a small part of economic reality. As time went on, he became convinced that his approach to reality was the Christian approach, and took the New Testament as his guide. Christ's claim is greater, quote, "I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly." Unquote. As we have seen, the intimate connection between faith and economics precludes the possibility of Christian transcendentalism. Faith realizes the promise of abundance which is freely offered in grace. The idea of incarnation implies the conditions of real faith, namely, the dethronement of abstractionism and the internalizing of sovereignty. These have a real significance to economics. To deny the incarnation, to withhold faith, carries with it at the economic level the consequences of idolatry at all levels of reality. If religion is real, then infidelity has real consequences.